Recently, I got a question from Denny Marshall, and he's asking, I'm new to Alteryx. Have you done a video showing how to pass runtime parameters, like a beginning and end date, to a database query? And I did think about it for a minute, because I know I've covered interface tools, but I don't know that I've ever covered passing parameters, although I've done it a lot outside of the YouTube videos that I've done. So this presented a perfect opportunity to provide some new content here. So let's go ahead and dive in. I've got an Alteryx workflow here that I've built and it's complete. And so the way that I always like to do this is show the final product and then get rid of it and build it again, work our way sort of backwards in the process. So the design here is that I've got an input tool that calls a stored procedure from a Microsoft SQL Server database. And that stored procedure has two parameters, a begin date and an end date. And when it runs, it has a select statement and a where clause that filters out the records that are not inside the date range that we've passed to the stored procedure. Then I'm doing a couple other things where I'm summarizing the data by salesperson and their totals over that period of time that was entered, and kicking all of that out to an Excel spreadsheet when I'm done. Now you'll notice up at the top that there are a set of interface tools, and here's where it gets really interesting. One of the things Denny didn't ask was, how do we do this dynamically? Because initially this becomes a static process, so we're going to use interface tools to allow the user to input a date and then pass that date to a stored procedure, so then it filters out when it actually runs that query, rather than doing all of that work to filter the data out inside Alteryx itself. So it'll save us some time and some processing and compute power there. All right, let's go ahead and begin. I am going to delete all the work that I did previously. I know that's scary. And we're going to use an input data tool to go ahead and bring in this stored procedure. And I'm going to actually show you the stored procedure so you can see what it looks like. So let's click the down arrow here and let's choose data sources, and we're going to choose Microsoft SQL Server and Quick Connect. Of course, I could use Oracle if I wanted to, and any database that has that stored procedure functionality would work. I do have an existing connection to my local SQL Server that's installed on my computer, and the host is localhost. If you're doing this for work, that host is probably going to be an IP address or a server name, so you'll need to get that from your IT department. Also, you'll have to be told what the authentication type is of that particular SQL Server database. In my case, since it's installed as a demo on my machine, I'm using Windows authentication. There's a chance that your database, if you're getting it from work, requires SQL authentication rather than just Windows authentication, in which case you will need a username and a password. So I'm going to go back to Windows authentication. I'll test it just to make sure it works. And then I'm going to hit the down arrow to choose the database that I'm going to use for this demo. And in this case, it's Worldwide Importers DW, which is the data warehouse version of Worldwide Importers. Now, you could follow along on all of this if you go to the Microsoft website and download SQL Server Express. It's free. And also download SQL Server Management Studio and install that. You'll get a development version of SQL that you can play around with. Find the Worldwide Importers database. It'll come as a backup file, and restore that to your instance, and you're off and running. I recommend doing that. It's good to learn SQL and play around with it. So let's go ahead and click OK here. And I'm going to go to stored procedures on the choose table window. And the stored procedure I created custom for this demo is get orders by date range. And so now I'm going to go over into SQL Server Management Studio, and I'm going to show you this stored procedure that I created. So all of them start with create procedure and give it a name. I'm going to pass it two parameters, a begin date and an end date. Those parameters need to start with an @ symbol, and then I have to indicate the data type. In this case, it's a data type. And then we need after the create procedure and begin the procedure, we're going to set the no count parameter to on, because I don't want counts being displayed while this query is running. And then we give it the select statement that we're going to run. And the last part is the where clause. Very important. Don't forget the where clause. That is where we're going to say that we want data between order dates that we pass it, the begin date and the end date, which were the parameters up at the top. Whenever people have problems getting the data to filter correctly, it's usually because they forgot the where clause or they wrote it incorrectly. Now, I can go in and I can test this real quick. I've got a join in here where I'm bringing in the employee's name, so I need to comment that out. But I always like to test it and make sure it's running correctly. that's functioning there, and then so the whole thing together with the join is working with the salesperson. Good. So now I can execute this query and it will create the stored procedure. I've already done that previously. And now you understand why it's asking for these parameters. So it needs a value, and this data warehouse sample data is a bit old. So we're going to go back to 2013-06-01. I want to just look at June of 2013. So we're going to go to the 30th. And I'm going to click OK. Now, when I do this, I'm going to get an error message when I come out of here. And that error message is going to say that it couldn't pull any columns into the data set. So I need to go back into the query. I did that intentionally because I want you to see why that happens. And now I need to go to SQL Editor, and you'll notice that it's just passing the dates as raw values. I need to put this in single quotes, opening and closing single quotes. And then I can go in and test the query, just make sure it works. Click OK. This passes those parameters as date types rather than just numeric when it doesn't have those single quotes on it. Okay, so let's go ahead and run it just one time to make sure it works. I'm going to pull the browse tool in and we'll run. And when we look at the data, you'll see it's exactly what I showed you in SQL Server Management Studio, where I've got the salesperson, the description, the order key, and some quantities and sales values. Now let's go ahead and make of this the dynamic component. Right now this is static. It's always going to run for June, and there's no way for me to change it unless I edit the Alteryx workflow. So let's use the interface tools from the interface palette and choose the date tool and drag that onto our canvas. I'm going to bring these two tools down and give myself a little more space here. And then we're going to take the magnifying glass from the date interface and drop it on top of the lightning bolt on the input data. And now I need to configure this correctly. I'm going to ignore the error for a minute because I want to go back and I want to give the user some indication of what they're supposed to enter. So I'm going to say enter beginning order date. Okay. So they know what they're supposed to enter. And now what I'm going to do, thinking ahead on how all of this is going to work, is I need to replace a value. Whatever date the user enters, I want it to be replaced inside the data set here, or inside the stored procedure. And right now the dates are the default ones that I put. So I want to go back and actually edit those dates. And I want to make them sort of nonsensical dates, but also dates that will still pass validation. And so what we're going to do is we're going to make this 1900-01-01 as the begin date, and we're going to make the end date 2099-12-31. Now those dates don't make any sense for this data set, but they are valid dates, and so I'm not going to get any errors when that input tool tries to validate the stored procedure. Now I can go back to my update tool, update action, and I want to click this line here that says file equals and then the SQL statement here. So I'm choosing this, and then I want to say replace a string, specific string, and the string I want to replace is just that 1900-01-01. I'm going to replace it with the value that the user chose. Now we need to do this whole entire thing again for the end date, so we'll choose another date tool and drag it on, click on the magnifying glass, hold my mouse button down, and drag it to on top of the lightning bolt. And now I get a second tool, and I'm going to do this again, choose file value equals, replace a string, and now I want the second date here, which is the 2099 date. And it will be replaced with whatever date the user chose here. Now there's one other thing I want to do. I want to give the user an indication of the second date they're supposed to enter. That's not a begin date, that's an ending date. Okay. There we go. Now we're all set up. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put in the rest of the things that we want to get done, which is being able to do like the sum for the salesperson. So we'll drop a summarize tool on. We want to group by the salesperson, and then we want to get the total excluding tax sum for that salesperson. And so we'll say total sales excluding tax. So I want to know how that salesperson is doing, and then we're going to sort it descending by the total amount so I can see who the top performers are. Okay, that's the plan. One last thing we should do is I'm going to choose an output tool, and I'm going to put this out just to an Excel spreadsheet here so I can see what it looks like when it runs. I already have a spreadsheet created called Alteryx past data range, so we'll use that. I'm just putting this in my temp folder, and we'll call this orders, just to give it a name, and I'm going to change the create new sheet to overwrite. So as I'm testing this, I can overwrite it without it throwing me an error. All right, I think we're good to go. Now, normally, you're probably used to just running the workflow, but in this case, we want to click on the magic wand, and that will run an analytic app and let us insert or select the interface properties we want here. Now, one pet peeve of this is I wish the interface tool would let me choose which calendar date to start with, because these dates are older, so we have to click all the way back in time. Of course, I don't have to use a calendar control. I could just use a text box and say that the user has to input a date and validate that an actual date was used. That's an option. But for demo purposes, I just wanted to show that a calendar is possible. Okay, so we're going from June 1st to June 30th of 2013. We'll go ahead and click finish and it will run. Now what I want to do is go to the show output log, and I just want to make sure that this alias translation for the actual query is correct, that it replaced the values in there, and it did. The values say 2013-0601 and 2013-0630. Remember that when I changed it, it was 1900-0101 and 2099-1231. So that's working correctly. I also know that there's 214,000 records in the database, and it's only returning 5,338. So that seems to be correct for just that 1 month. Now, if I click OK, Excel will open, and I can actually examine the values in here, and I would expect about 500,000. Yep. So that looks correct for that 1 month. Now let's just make sure this wasn't some fluke and it's actually working correctly. Let's change the end date to the end of the year and click finish. It will run the workflow again and look at the output log and just make sure that 1231 is in the stored procedure. And it is. And when I open the Excel spreadsheet again, I'm expecting there to be about $2 million in sales, well, almost 3 million, and yep, that's what I would expect. Kayla's first, Archie's third, and Amy's fourth. So all of that looks good. Looks like it's running correctly. It looks like it's coming out of the workflow the way that I expected. Okay, so thank you to Denny Marshall for his comments. See, I read comments and I see what people want to hear about, and I try and fulfill requests when I can. Hope this dynamic way of doing a workflow with interface tools is useful to you. That's all for now. Happy data hunting with Alteryx. I'll catch you on the next one.